Good afternoon and welcome to the Virtually Speaking podcast. My name is Pete Fletcher, aka Pedro Arrow, and joining me as usual is my good friend, Mr. John Nicholson. John, how you doing, buddy?
I'm practicing my duck, dodge, dip, and duck. I've been really getting into sports lately, and specifically competitive dodgeball. You can it's on ESPN 8, the Ocho.
Yeah.
So it's just I stay up at night watching ESPN 8. So
yeah, I would love to see you practicing your dodgeball. You're dodging in your house, watching the TV. I love that. So John, vSphere 8 came out while we were at VMware Explore, and so many announcements. That was certainly one of the big ones. And I knew, we've already covered vSAN 8, the week of VMware with Pete Keeler, but I knew it was going to be, I've been looking forward to getting this gentleman on to give us some of the dirty details around vSphere 8. And so joining us this week on Virtually Speaking is Féidhlim O'Leary. Féidhlim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Pete. Thanks for having me, guys. This is my my podcast debut.
Yeah, absolutely.
So excited to be here.
Yeah, you're actually on Ken Werneberg's team. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Been on Ken's team for almost a year now, but I've been at VMware for over 11 years. So grew up with vSphere nearly.
Yeah. John, he's one of those success stories that have paid their dues in the world of support for many years, have learned to know the product inside and out, and finally got to the point where they're in a glorious job like tech marketing. So welcome.
It's a fun place to be.
Definitely.
Absolutely. So yeah, as we said at the top, there's been so many announcements. vSphere 8 was certainly one of the bigger ones, made the general session. Raghu, it was one of the first things out of Raghu's mouth for this general session. And there were many different features in that announcement. So why don't we just talk about a few of them? I know vSphere with Tanzu has some updates. I know that we heard a new term, the emergence of the DPU. I want to talk a little bit about that. Just give us an idea of what that is, and also lifecycle management. So many other updates inside of vSphere 8. But Féidhlim, where can we start?
Yeah. So before we get to the exciting stuff like the DPU and that new stuff, I'll just touch on some of the improvements that are coming down the line with vSphere 8. So there's a couple of new things coming in the area of Vmotion, and Vmotion, we take it for granted. You probably use it on a daily basis, but there's two important new things coming down the line with Vmotion, and the first thing is the ability for applications or VMs to be aware that a vMotion is going to take place. So sometimes you have VMs that are very sensitive to that stun time that happens to a VM when you vMotion it, and that can be compounded if the VM is particularly large as well. And certain applications like telco applications, cluster applications, some databases don't like that stun time at all. So what we're introducing is what we're calling in-app notifications. And what happens there is you'll initiate a vMotion like normal, but the vMotion won't actually take effect right away. There'll be a notification sent into the guest OS, and it'll interact with VMware tools. And you'll be able to code a script or code your application to react to that notification. It could say, okay, I know that there's a vMotion has been triggered. I want to, maybe stop services or quiesce my application, failover, do something that can prepare the application so that it can better respond to the vMotion event. And once the application does what it needs to do, it'll send a notification back, and the vMotion will continue as normal. So it's there to improve the interoperability between these very small number of or use cases of applications that just don't play 100% nice with vMotion today.
Well, and that's going to be like kind of the weird ultra latency sensitive in-memory databases, or maybe some of the like telco like SIP brokers. Those guys get real weird if like, hey, if it's my jitter buffer is only 60 milliseconds or something.
Or voice over IP applications as well is another use case that you don't want to call to drop or something like that as well because of the vMotion Suntime.
And is this something that that it's an intelligent, it already knows what to look for, or is this something where there are parameters that are set to help with this?
Yeah, there's parameters that need to be set, and I suppose the application needs to be developed to understand these notifications. So it could be built into a custom application, or you could have a standalone, I suppose, dedicated little micro application that's intercepting these vMotion alerts, and then that forwards on to your full application that will do the work to prepare for that vMotion event. And there's timeout values as well. So if the application doesn't do what it needs to do in a certain period of time, the vMotion will just still continue. So it's not designed to block vMotions from happening indefinitely. And that timeout is configurable, user configurable at a host level, or you can even do it at a VM level as well if you have a particularly sensitive application.
Wow,
so this reminds me of the pre-freeze and post-thaw scripts you could set within v8EP before like backups hit.
Oh, yeah.
So I assume there's a similar framework there. So I mean, this is new, but the whole concept of there's about to be a potential hit. Let's take some proactive actions, like you say, quiesce something. This isn't a new construct in some ways. It's just being able to have awareness of it for vMotion, which is vMotion historically was 100 times less impactful than say a v8EP snapshot. But we've come a long way on both those, I guess.
Exactly. As I said, there's a very, very small number of applications that get impacted by vMotion. And one of the other things as well to help with this is when you do have this turned on a virtual machine, it's removed from DRS automatic load balancing. So DRS won't automatically try and move these sensitive VMs.
You don't get like a race condition. You won't get a race condition of new placements being placed there because that host is trying to drain.
Yeah, exactly. It will let you still put a host into maintenance mode, but DRS isn't going to try and move these particularly sensitive VMs around if they've got the in-app notification turned on.
Okay. So this is the other direction. That makes sense. So it's going to do, rather than like an anti-affinity rule, it's please don't vMotion me unless you have to, unless the full maintenance is triggered.
Sort of an opt-out. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the other cool thing in vMotion that will benefit just vMotion in general is what we're calling this unified data transport protocol. So I don't know if you've ever noticed that when you do a vMotion or a storage vMotion in particular of a powered on VM, it's nice and fast. And that's because when the VM's powered on, even the disk migration will use the vMotion protocol. But if a VM is powered off, or if a powered on VM has a snapshot, basically any cold disk will end up getting copied with NFC. And NFC is slow compared to vMotion.
Yeah, so NFC didn't use the new TCP stack, right?
It's even irrelevant to the TCP stack. It's just a slow protocol that caps out at around, I think it's about 1.3 gigabits per second. Whereas vMotion,
that kind of made sense if it was powered off back in the day because there weren't as many QoS options, and so to a certain degree, not increasing the top line prevented noisy neighbor issues. But like you say, since it's being used for certain storage vMotion scenarios and other things, that's problematic. And
the vMotion protocol, the theoretical peak performance, I can't do this speed now in my lab, is 80 gigabits per second. I just don't have that.
Is that like multiple VM kernel ports? Is that per VM kernel port or multiple? Or
I think it must be. It's kind of the peak performance that vMotion could do in absolute ideal circumstances. So the unified data transport protocol essentially combines the two. When we do when we're doing a cold migration of a disk now with UDT, it essentially uses the NFC protocol as kind of the control mechanism, but it'll offload the data transfer to the vMotion protocol. So you'll get a huge increase in speed when you're doing migrations of cold disks. And the simple way to turn this on is all you have to do is enable the provisioning service on a VM kernel port. So this could either be your existing vMotion VM kernel interface, or you can create a new one. It doesn't really matter. But even in my own lab, I'm running relatively old hardware at this stage. I was seeing like a 5x increase in the speed, going from about a transfer rate of about 1 gigabit per second, turned on UDT or turned on the provisioning protocol, and it went up to 6 gigabits per second. So I saw more than a 5x increase in my slow lab. I'm sure in production environments, you're going to see even greater return. So that's cool, and that'll benefit everything. That'll benefit all storage vMotion operations.
Well, yeah, and there's some clone operations and other things that I think also use NFC. So particularly some VDI workflows and things like that. Yeah, that'll be fun.
Yeah. So they're the big vMotion things that are coming down the line. The other just small thing that I'll touch on before we get into the meatier stuff is we're really improving our ability to deploy Windows 11 at scale. So obviously Windows 11 isn't new. It's been out a couple of years now. But one of the the strict requirements for it was the TPM device. And now we have that option of vTPM. It's been around in 6.7. But there's all these different caveats. TPM should be unique per OS instance, at least in the physical world, they're always unique. So we had all these kind of little caveats. But with vSphere 8, we now have this cool option when we're deploying Windows 11 VMs from templates or we're cloning them. We have a very simple option to either keep the existing TPM if we need to keep it for whatever reason. But the best practice if you're deploying Windows 11 at scale will be to replace the TPM. So we'll automatically replace the vTPM device on all these template deployments. So each Windows VM will have a unique TPM device like it would in the physical world as well.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
This kind of reminds me, and you're welcome to groan, of SID cloning back in the day. There was like one weird security quirk of like the local admins could basically cross attack each other if you didn't clone the SID. But no, I'm sure having a unique certificate store. I guess you would probably need to keep that cloned if you're using like BitLocker or some awful ingest encryption system. But otherwise, net new is going to be superior.
I mean, this even kind of follows Microsoft's best practice when it comes to Windows 11 VMs as well. We've worked with them in the background as well to come up with this solution. The guidance would be that if you're creating a Windows 11 template that you're going to deploy net new VMs from, the best practice would be to configure that VM not to use any TPM reliant services at that point. So save your gold image without BitLocker turned on or those sort of things, and turn them on after template deployment. Because otherwise you do run into that catch-22 where if you save the gold image with BitLocker or something enabled, you need to keep copying that TPM device, and then you have a fleet of VMs that all have the same TPM device, and that's not really best practice either.
Yeah, I'm just going to use vSAN encryption and not mess with ingest encryption. Like it's 1,000 times easier to use. So,
well, yeah, I mean, BitLocker is just one example of a TPM feature. There, I'm sure there are others.
Of course.
Well, you're copying a key manager, like a temp server would be another case.
Yeah, so they're kind of the smaller things. Where I think the theme of this release is really going is in kind of the hardware acceleration space. We're ramping up our support and our compatibility for GPUs, adding the ability to have more GPUs per ESXi, more vGPUs per virtual machine. We're simplifying how those can be consumed by VMs with things called device groups. Basically, that's it could be multiple GPUs or a GPU and a NIC that are a kind of a hardware pair, and they can be absorbed into a VM as a single unit. So it just really helps in the ML and AI space to consume all these new hardware accelerators that are coming down the line. But in the same kind of theme is what you mentioned at the start, Pete, is the DPU, the data processing unit. So we've been working in the background. This was announced, I think, 2 years ago as Project Monterey. So if you Google Project Monterey and avoid getting it confused with Apple's Monterey OS,
exactly.
You'll find our announcements. Kit Colbert, I think, had some blogs out there a couple of years ago. And essentially, we've done a lot of partnering with hardware partners like NVIDIA and Sando and things like that. And they almost tout these DPUs as being like data centers on a chip. They're little compute units. They're PCI style devices. Little compute units on them, memory. There's a little bit of storage. There's NICs. They also can go as people may call them smart NICs as well. But basically, there are these new type of hardware accelerators, and we're going to use those, and we're putting ESXi on them, and that's what we're calling our distributed services engine, or vSphere distributed services engine. And the first of many to come features that are going to get offloaded to these DPUs in vSphere is our networking functionality. So with NSX, leveraging some of that networking processing off the x86 CPU onto the DPU, giving you better performance and freeing up the x86 of resources for your workload. So you're getting a performance benefit on both sides.
Okay, so you're actually, as the name says, you're actually distributing a service off of the core of vSphere onto another piece of hardware, so to leverage some higher performance and to make some room for other applications that need the existing performance.
Absolutely. I mean, as ESXi has gotten bigger and better, and we have all these other things like vSAN and NSX in the picture, there's less and less resources for your actual workloads. When you just have, let's say, your management stack and your infrastructure up and running, we're starting to eat into some of this compute a little bit.
Yeah.
So that's one of the avenues that the DPU is looking to solve, is to offload those management services, NSX services, in the future storage services and things like that to the DPU, giving them better performance at the DPU, but also freeing up the resources for your VMs.
Well, and this is something that I know some of the vSphere 8 features are helping support roll these compute latency sensitive applications. But if you look at some of the most persnickety, virtual appliances you ever deployed, they were firewalls and load balancers. They would demand 100% CPU, latency sensitive flag. They'd occasionally, and certain networking vendors who I shall shame, on Twitter, not here, would demand core penning, which is incredibly stupid. But you would end up with these insane requirements that severely impacted your consolidation ratios, and just caused headaches in general. And being able to yeet those services over to those ARM Cortexes who have, in some cases, FPGA coprocessors and can have no problem doing firewalling, of 200. I remember thinking of an NSX VM that could handle 40 gigs was massive. Now, being able to shove that onto a DPU that can handle 200 gig and not touch my host CPUs and do anything unnatural to them, that's a big win.
Exactly, yeah, and it's going to start with just the network traffic offloading. The firewalling and some of the enhanced security is going to come later. So it's walk before we run sort of thing with the DPUs, but we will eventually get there where every host almost will have a DPU, and a lot of the management, the infrastructure services, vSAN services, NSX services will be running on the DPU, like the vendors have even suggested themselves, calling it a data center on a chip.
So Féidhlim, when you say ESXi, one of the things that first comes to my mind, as an administrator, is like, oh wait, so I have to update that ESXi host, So is this,
you do.
When we're talking lifecycle management, I know VMware, has vSphere Lifecycle Manager. Is this something that it works with VLCM, or do I have to figure out a new way to patch these new DPUs?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was one of my first kind of things when I thought about this. Are we doubling the number of ESXIs that someone has to manage in an infrastructure? And the short answer really is no. So if you're installing this day one, you pop the ISO over ILO or iDRAC or whatever, and you boot your installer, it'll just show up as a checkbox. It'll recognize the DPU, you hit the checkbox, and it'll install the same version of ESXi onto the DPU and onto the x86 compute layer as well. And when you're doing updates with VLCM, it just sees that. It sees that the host has a DPU. It's one remediation. You remediate your host as normal. It knows it's got a DPU, and it'll always keep those versions in lockstep. So you patch from, you go 8.0 to 8.0 update 1, the DPU will get update 1, and it'll always stay in sync. So there's no extra lifecycle management to do.
Good. Yeah, that's always a headache, and it's always a consideration, especially as people, the larger the environments get, the more that they have to manage and try to balance. This seems like it could have the potential to add many more, but I'm glad to see that this is all just incorporated inside of VLCM.
Well, and it builds on all the other work. Like if you're still running an old vSphere release, you may not be aware, but being able to pre-stage along with quick boot, particularly if you're just doing a vSphere driver hit, as well as other optimizations to the boot cycle. I mean, we patched a cluster recently for a security patch, and I mean, each host was back up because it can do the quick boot and skip EFI and all that. It was back up in a couple minutes. Like it's this era of, I've got to update my host, I've got to plan for like a multi-day adventure. Like that's done, and it's getting better.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's some enhancements in vSphere 8 as well that you touched on as well, like staging the cluster patches as well is almost a huge win in itself. And I know Update Manager used to be able to do that in the past, but it's great to see VLCM be able to do it now, where you could stage all your actual payload down to your 64 node cluster or however large it is, and that's all before you actually hit the remediate button. Before, that would have to go down to each individual host during the maintenance mode period of the host. And, that's a lot of time ate up with a host being stuck in maintenance mode when all it's doing is downloading some payload. So it's great to be able to stage those now again down to your clusters. And we're also bringing back parallel remediation in VLCM, where it can remediate multiple hosts in parallel. And this is actually will be really cool for greenfield sites. If they come off the rack, they're at a particular version that got installed at the factory, you'll be able to upgrade an entire cluster in minutes. If there's no workloads running on it, you don't have to worry about maintenance mode cycling through. Put everything into maintenance mode, parallel the entire 32, 64, 96 node cluster, and it'll be all done in minutes. So that'll be really cool as well for VLCM.
Yeah, for sure. I'm assuming vSAN, because it has dependency on storage in the individual compute, is that still a linear upgrade for VLCM, or is there any change there?
There is some, I can't remember now actually off the top of my head, but there is some allowance for parallel remediation with vSAN. The parallel remediation isn't fully automated in the sense that the administrator needs to decide, okay, how many hosts am I going to put into maintenance mode? So if I got 10 hosts, the administrator can go, okay, I know I can afford to put 4 at a time into maintenance mode, and the admin does that themselves. So in the case of a vSAN cluster, you'll again have to pre-prepare your hosts into maintenance mode, and then parallel remediate all those hosts. So the parallel remediation only happens on hosts that are pre-staged into maintenance mode.
Okay.
I suppose the reason, maybe a little bit of inside baseball, the reason that it's a manual process right now is we have some work to figure out with DRS to be more clever about putting multiple hosts into maintenance mode to avoid any sort of VM ping pong as one host goes into maintenance mode and then another one and things like that. So there's going to be improvements on that front as well in the future.
Good to hear it. So moving along, any news in the Tanzu space with vSphere with Tanzu?
Yes. There's a couple of cool things coming down the line in vSphere with Tanzu. I suppose the main thing is that we're taking this kind of, since we introduced vSphere with Tanzu and we had VMware integrated containers and that merged into the Tanzu space and things like that, we had all these multiple different TKG offerings. So we're consolidating that down into one unified offering. TKG 2.0, it can be colloquially called, but it's essentially one offering that will run everywhere, be it in your vSphere on-prem, in the cloud, things like that. So we don't have multiple TKG instances and offerings to maintain or customers to decide between anymore, which is great. The other major feature we're bringing out is workload availability zones. And these essentially allow us to define vSphere clusters as availability zones for our TKG instances. So we'll support up to 3 zones initially. And this will allow for 2 things. It'll allow for a stretched supervisor cluster. So today in vSphere 7, a supervisor cluster is siloed into one vSphere cluster. And then, right, if you wanted to have TKGs on multiple vSphere clusters, you needed 3 supervisor clusters or so. So we'll allow it for a stretched supervisor cluster, stretch it across 3 vSphere clusters. I have to say the word cluster so many times when we're talking about this. And then with that stretched supervisor cluster, you can deploy Tanzu Kubernetes grid clusters, also stretched. So you're stretching everything across 3 vSphere clusters for increased availability and maximizing all your available resources as well.
So to be clear, when you say stretched, you don't mean like a traditional stretched cluster up to 5 or 10 milliseconds away. You mean like 3 racks within 1 millisecond of each other, right?
Yes, that's a good differentiation. Yeah,
I mean, maybe like different buildings on the same campus and you have an ECMP mesh, but you need full connectivity between all 3 racks of each other.
Yeah, I'm not talking, stretched in that sense, or a vSAN.
Not London to Amsterdam or anything.
Yeah, no. It's more of a logical stretch. It's essentially taking your 3 vSphere clusters, cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, and just making them as a pool that can become one big giant vSphere Tanzu supervisor cluster.
So I guess a couple of benefits there. One, you can scale past the 6496 cluster limitation, and I say cluster limitation like we're talking about at this point. You can shove like a petabyte of RAM in each cluster. What the hell are you doing at that scale? But let's say you are, I don't know, some intergalactic app scaler, and you could scale to multiple clusters, but also more practically, you might say, okay, one of these clusters is a different vendor. I'm doing patching of firmware and drivers and vSphere and really boring stuff on the underlay. I'm going to patch one cluster at a time. So that way, if that patch goes bad, I hit a bad driver issue or something happens during Lifecycle, I have that. It's kind of like what we did with pods with Horizon in that regard. I've got an extra kind of landing place.
Yeah, when it just gives an extra level of availability as well, like you said, when you're doing maintenance or if there's a particular outage in a rack or something like that, you've still got your application that is running in these TKG clusters isn't going to be impacted. It's layers upon layers upon layers of different availability the whole way down.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm gonna have to go dig in the notes and figure out like how much isolation I can put there. Like, can I cross layer 3 boundaries between those and things like that? But this is cool though. Like, this is a great foundational for scalable, resilient management, because if you've ever worked with stretched clusters, oftentimes, and this these types of things and vplexes and all that whole life, is you often found that the systems that managed the stretched environment were the least like natively cross-site aware resilient. They required the most work. You'd have to stretch layer 2 or do weird stuff. And I like the idea of the management layer being kind of born ready for that multi zone resiliency.
Exactly, and the scalability is also, like you said, the huge thing. You can only scale a cluster so much, but now you'll be able to scale 3 clusters as needed. And that was a challenge that we saw with customers as well. They had deployed their supervisor clusters on a particular vSphere cluster, and filled its capacity essentially, but they had all this other capacity in their other clusters, and it would have been great at the time to be able to stretch the supervisor across all those as well and just consume everything else.
Yeah. Do some hole filling between the different apps or zones and things like that. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And while 64 and 96 maybe your cluster limit size, a lot of people artificially have internal limits for very valid reasons to say, hey, we don't go beyond X number because that's a rack, or we don't like managing clusters beyond 16 for various operational reasons. And so this gives the app team a little more resource flexibility without necessarily having to force unnatural things on the underlay. So good times.
Yeah, nice. Exactly. And one of the other big asks in the Tanzu space was around authentication or identity providers. So in vSphere 7, all the authentication has to go through the vCenter single sign-on. And typically in these sort of environments, there's a pretty firm, I suppose, separation between the infrastructure managers or the vSphere administrators and the developers or the DevOps folks. And trying to get the DevOps folks coming in to use vCenter SSO, it just didn't always work.
No, of course not.
So in vSphere 8 and vSphere Tanzu and TKG 2.0, we're introducing Pinniped integration. So Pinniped allows us to federate to any OIDC provider. So whatever the customers are currently using today, Pinniped will be able to integrate in with that. And it doesn't go through SSO whatsoever. It doesn't go through vCenter. vCenter could be offline, and DevOps users could still authenticate into their clusters and continue doing their work. It's a complete separation of the authentication space from
the federation. The federation is being handled by Pinniped, you said?
By Pinniped, yeah. Pinniped will integrate with your particular IDP. Yeah, it's an open source. It's an open source project that VMware supports.
Very nice.
Well, and that's nice, and it makes a lot of sense because the VMware infrastructure layer, that being able to be isolated from an identity basis from the app and the dev infrastructure layer, that makes a lot of sense for security, for operational reasons. I mean, obviously, it sounds like they don't want to be dependent on a vCenter server, which I get and I fully respect.
Well, they don't want to get in and manage one either. They want to. It's a different world, right?
Well, but also like just security teams like seeing separation on the underlay of, hey, these go in different directions. So that way, if there's a compromise or a stolen token, you don't end up owning the entire kingdom.
Exactly. So that kind of wraps up the major tentpole features. We talked about the distributed services engine, basically data center on a chip with the DPUs. We're starting to offload the NSX and network traffic and functions to that. We talked about the improvements in the area of lifecycle management, parallel remediation, staging. Those in combination with things like Quick Boot are really going to improve lessen the time spent, doing those lifecycle and maintenance operations.
Yeah.
AIML is, I think that's one to watch definitely in the future. AIML is it's taking off like a rocket ship. It's, getting into every industry. So we're gonna probably see a lot more in that space, in the next couple of years as well. So definitely one to watch there. But that coupled with the usual things like, hardware version gets increased to version 20. That's needed for a couple of different things like the in-app notifications that we spoke about with Vmotion, brings some of the new guest operating system support, increases CPU, memory, that usual stuff. Well, yeah, and there's one other little thing that might be interest to people in this day and age of energy consumption is vSphere Green metrics. So these will be some new usage metrics: power usage for the system, idle usage, VM usage, and with those you'll be able to check your power consumption, use that data to then kind of extrapolate how much energy am I using? How much is the data center costing me in terms of energy usage and things like that? So we've got those new metrics coming down the line, and VROPS will be able to ingest those metrics too and give you kind of a much prettier output than just the vSphere client as well. So one to watch as well, because energy prices seem to just be going up here anyway, at least.
Yeah, no, everywhere for sure. And being able to monitor the energy and carbon emissions is definitely something that's becoming more of a requirement these days. So that's really cool.
And the use case that I've kind of seen some excitement for that beyond the kind of the ESG typical stuff is you've got, as there's more smaller embedded deployments in places that are not on traditional grids. So either IoT edge deployments, really remote branch sites, you're operating on a ship. You've got a compressor station on an oil platform that has to run off diesel generators, things like that, to where, your cost per watt of a VM is, I may complain about power costing me 15 cents a kilowatt, but you're looking at because of all the logistics of getting that fuel there in the middle of the North Sea or somewhere odd, okay, exactly, now it's like $1. So there are some customers who are going to pay attention to that, not just for their shareholder ESG reports, but actually some pretty huge cost impacts.
Yeah, that's a good point, and because I've supported customers that are on submarines, or that they pack up all their gear and put onto the back of a truck when they're doing the Formula One tours or around Europe and the world and stuff like that. So they want to make sure that when they are plugged in and turned on, that they're operating optimally as well in terms of their power consumption.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, this has been good. And I know there's so much more there, John. We could spend probably 30 minutes just talking about all the different consumption models that vSphere is expanding to, and so many other things around vSphere 8, whether it's on premises, whether it's in the cloud or on the edge. But we're going to leave it here for now. Féidhlim, I want to thank you for joining us. One place I know that people can go to find more about vSphere is core.vmware.com. That's where most of the good blogs that I read about, it's the one I'm reading right now. There's a technical blog that I know you've contributed a lot to. Aside from that, Féidhlim, is there anything else that we want to share in terms of where to go to find content around vSphere 8?
No, not really. Core.vmware.com is probably your one-stop shop. I actually recently, or yesterday, just made a kind of a dedicated vSphere 8 focus page there. So if you just go to core.vmware.com /vSphere, you'll see a vSphere 8 button. It's sparsely populated right now, but once the product releases, that's where you'll see everything that we will eventually put out for vSphere 8.
Beautiful. Very nice. Féidhlim, thank you for joining us. And man, open door invitation. Anytime you want to come back, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Thanks, Pete.
All right. Well, that music tells me it's time to go. And so if you want to get in touch with us, send us an email at podcast@vmware.com. You can subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice by searching Virtually Speaking Podcast. You can catch this and all episodes at vspeakingpodcast.com. Big thanks to Féidhlim for telling us all about vSphere 8. We're back next week, but until then, bye for now.